Hello to you, wherever you are. My name is Daniel Dioka. I'm an associate professor in practice in urban planning at the GSD, and I am genuinely thrilled to have this chance to present to you This Land is Your Land, Native Americans Remake the City. This is actually one of two studio modules that I'm offering this semester that deal with Indigenous design and planning. I'm super duper excited about both of them, and I hope you will sign up for one or both. You can sign up for one, or you can sign up for both. If you sign up for both, they're different. There won't be much overlap. And if you sign up for just one, that's fine too. You certainly would not be at a disadvantage. So the studio is open to everyone. In fact, I'm hoping to get a good mix of students from across the departments. In planning the studio, I had the fortune to work with the GSD's brand new Indigenous Design Collective. So Elsa Hoover and Heidi Brandow on the left will be our TAs. Our client is the Native American Community Development Institute, NACD for short, one of the very few Native-focused community development organizations. Our site is the Phillips neighborhood in Minneapolis, home to one of the only Native American districts in the United States. The immediate goal of the studio is to work with NACD to help make this district better reflect the needs of the Native American residents who call this district home. Drawing from NACD's community blueprint, students will have the opportunity to work on any number of community-defined architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and urban design projects. These include outdoor public spaces for Native American ceremonies and powwows, a new Native American urban farm, a center for indigenous cosmology, strategies for indigenous streetscaping, strategies for housing, many other things, including projects that are not listed here. While the immediate goal of the studio is therefore somewhat pragmatic, there are broader goals. One is to think about land use in the context of the ongoing struggle for indigenous self-determination. Another is to learn from indigenous ways of building, indigenous ways of conceiving of our relationship to our natural surroundings in our era of rampant environmental destruction. There are important lessons here for sure. So I want to stress that the studio is meant to have broad implications for architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and urban design, however, wherever, and with whomever you practice it. Another recent event that gives this issue importance is the recent Supreme Court ruling that half of Oklahoma is an Indian reservation. I could also point to the recent protests around the Dakota Access Pipeline, which definitely evidence the renewed strength of the generations-long fight by tribal nations and indigenous activists over land, treaty rights, and discrimination. And we could also point to the nationwide movement to confront systematic racism, sparked in part by the brutal murder of George Floyd, which, as you know, happened in Minneapolis. In the US, there are over 300 federal Indian reservations covering over 50 million acres in 36 states, but a large majority of Native Americans live off reservations in urban areas. You see on the right here how this number is increasing. And this amounts to what some have referred to as another Great Migration. This has a lot to do with the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, which encouraged Native Americans to assimilate into the general population by moving to cities. You're looking here at propaganda that was put out by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. These go hand in hand with this incredible film that was made about Native Americans who were resettled in Los Angeles. But the assumptions behind the Indian Relocation Act and similarly short-sighted, callous, and colonialist Indian termination policies, the assumption that assimilation is desirable, that relocation to metropolitan job centers would reduce the poverty endemic to isolated rural reservations, these assumptions were deeply flawed. As one commentator put it, when folks got off the bus, there was nothing to receive them, and they were met with racially charged law enforcement, redlined and segregated neighborhoods, and overt racism in hiring practices. In response, an urban indigenous movement emerged in the late 1960s. Some of you might know about the takeover of Alcatraz in 1969. In no city was this movement more pronounced than in Minneapolis, where in 1968, a group of activists founded the legendary American Indian Movement. Here are some of its founders who really modeled their activism after the Black Panthers Minneapolis today remains a center for the struggle for indigenous rights, in part because it has one of the largest urban Native American populations in the country, most of them hailing from one of the 11 federally recognized tribes in the state, all of which are Ojibwe or Dakota tribes. But due to continued discrimination, disinvestment, and neglect, Native Americans living in Minneapolis, like their peers in other U.S. cities, face poverty, unemployment, and undereducation rates that are nearly double what they are for the general urban population. And they account, in fact, for a disproportionate percentage of people experiencing homelessness. Don't have time to go through these statistics, but they're pretty startling. In Minneapolis, there's maybe no better sign of this than the so-called Wall of Forgotten Natives, the city's biggest homeless camp, about which much has been written. So where do we come in? The site for the studio is again the Phillips neighborhood in Minneapolis, home to one of the only Native American districts in the U.S. You can see it's right in the middle of the city, very high Native American population, fairly low education rates, fairly low median home values. So if we take a closer look, a lot of Native homes, a lot of Native-owned businesses, nonprofit organizations. So for example, the American Indian Center, the All My Relations Art Gallery, the Little Earth Housing Development, the only Native American public housing project in the States. Franklin Avenue runs right through it. It's also known as the American Indian Cultural Corridor. It's really the heart of this community. Murals are everywhere. They appear on just about every surface all over the neighborhood. I mentioned earlier this community blueprint. I mentioned we'd be drawing from it for our projects. So I vetted these to make sure there's good opportunities for students in all departments. So basically, you're going to pick one of these and you're going to get to work. You can work alone. You can work in a small group. If you have another idea that's not in the blueprint, it's fine so long as it's vetted through NACTI and me, of course. But I want to say there's really an opportunity to work on some really unique community-defined programs here. Honestly, as someone who plans and designs public spaces, I can't really think of anything more interesting than working with an indigenous community to create public places for ceremonies or design a powwow grounds. I think there's some really, really, really great things to work on here. You'll get a lot of feedback along the way from me, of course, but also from people who live, work, and hang out in the district, from Native designers, artists, historians, chefs, scholars, activists, you name it. We're remote. We're certainly not in a vacuum. We'll have a virtual field trip, and we'll meet a lot of people you see here, but a lot of these people will also join us for crits. Indeed, this is the advantage, I think, of the virtual format. You'll be in dialogue with a lot of people. Very rarely will you have one-on-one crits. Small group crits with your peers, our client, and our studio friends will be the norm. The disadvantage, of course, is that we won't get to travel to the site. That's where Jada comes in. This is Jada Gray Eagle. She's a photojournalist. She took many of the pictures you've been looking at. She'll be a sort of liaison to the studio. She'll document the site. She lives nearby, and she'll conduct interviews with people as needed. This being a module, not too much time to read, but we have assembled a good bibliography for you. I want to use this opportunity to say there is, of course, a wonderfully rich and exciting Indigenous design movement, which we'll be in dialogue with. We're not talking about bingo halls. Here's the first bingo hall built on the Seminole Tribe of Florida's reservation. We're talking about things like some of the projects that you maybe saw at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. Canada's entry was called Unceded Voice of the Land. It showcased 18 prominent Indigenous Canadian architects. It's a terrific resource. Here in the States, right in the middle of our site, sits the Minneapolis American Indian Center by Hodney Stagberg, with its woven wood facade by George Morrison and the ceremonial circle. One of a few really remarkable cultural centers we'll look at, another one being the Poe Cultural Center and Museum. Could also point to this Cultural Cree Institute. Douglas Cardinal is a celebrated Indigenous designer you probably know. St. Mary's Church was among his earlier works. More recently, he designed this National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Look at a couple housing prototypes. This is the Wadi Housing Development in New Mexico by the Sustainable Native Communities Collaborative. There's some wonderful schools, some of them perhaps lesser known than they should be. The Gordon Robertson Education Center, for example. More recently, the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, designed by Antoine Predock and Studio Indigenous. Still more recently, this library exhibition and conference space at the UBC Library. This is designed by Alfred Waugh, an Indigenous architect. Public Spaces, Studio Indigenous did this installation, a contemporary wigwam. This is the Gathering Circle, part of the Spirit Garden in Thunder Bay, Ontario. So you see a lot of this architecture represents or references traditional structures. I want to emphasize, though, that these structures are not just there for us to riff on. In fact, they are built still because, frankly, they're just the best way to build things sometimes. Some of the photos I'm showing you are, in fact, rare ones. As a recent article on Indigenous architecture put it, architecture has been a tool of colonialism in Canada. You could say the same about the States. Settlers arrived. They knocked down the wigwams, teepees, longhouses, slope roof sheds, and other architecture of people indigenous to what became Canada. In their place now stands a 150-year legacy of built erasure. Thought I'd end by showing some work from previous studios I've taught, just to give you a flavor of the kind of stuff that comes out of my studios. So last year we looked at affordable housing in Los Angeles. Began by making board games about the politics of building affordable housing. Went on a field trip, talked to a lot of activists, architects, planners. Students then got to pick a project to work on. This is a proposal by Yashwin Lee for the future of Chinatown, presented as a graphic novel. Here's a proposed community land trust in East Los Angeles by Jose Esparza. 2018, we looked at Black Lives Matter activism in North St. Louis and made projects that addressed reparations in one way or another. For our warm-up assignment, we made a newspaper that looked at the community. We went on our field trip. Student projects were again very varied. This is a project by Mariana Paisana. It turns a prison into a community center. This is a proposal by Jakob Younghaas for a brick bank. The idea is to empower the community to capture the wealth inherent in bricks from vacant buildings, which are actually extremely valuable and sought after. 2017, we looked at refugee resettlement in the Rust Belt. Started with a mapping exercise. Students had to find a home for a refugee family. We went on our field trip where we met lots of recently resettled refugees and also
people who resettle refugees. Projects were again very diverse. I think that's the larger point I want to make here. So this is a project about trauma-informed design for a neighborhood where a lot of children were resettled. This is a public space project. There's a proposal by John Wagner and Chris Lau that proposes a fleet of mobile social services for refugees. 2016, we looked at race and housing in St. Louis. Our goal is to affirmatively further fair housing, which is something that is weirdly in the news right now in a very terrible and depressing way. For our warm-up assignment, we made comic books. Each student was assigned a different weapon of racial segregation, so thinking about appraisal and redlining to eminent domain. We are on our field trip, talking to primarily housing advocates and activists. Students chose from a wide variety of projects. There's a project by Jeremy Hartley and Women Segovia that is a sort of curricular.
So, you see in these studios, we don't create one plan. We create a book of good, bold, yet sensitive ideas around a theme. This studio will work in much the same way. Who should take this studio? Good designers, good planners, obviously, but also people should be good listeners. You should be interested in working with people and listening to the opinions of people outside of gun hall and as well as in gun hall. But this is an issue that needs the amazing energy and creativity of GSD students in every department. I really look forward to meeting you, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.